Welcome to week 4 of our 7 Weeks with St. Joseph series. I'm Dr. Mike Martocchio. In this series, we're taking just a couple minutes every week to reflect on St. Joseph in a variety of ways. Today, we're talking about St. Joseph as a king or royal heir. Now, this is one of those aspects of St. Joseph we don't think about a lot, but it's important because Jesus' claim to being in the kingly line of David comes through Joseph. So, Joseph, too, can be considered a king. Luke's genealogy, in chapter 3, starts out like this. When Jesus began his ministry, he was about 30 years of age. He was the son, as was thought, of Joseph, son of Heli. As was thought, the Greek word there is enomizeto. Nomizo in Greek means to practice, to consider, to do something customary. The root of the verb, however, is the noun nomos, meaning law. This word, suppose, then, is not meant to diminish the importance of Joseph. It's, first of all, pointing out that he's customarily thought of as Jesus' father, but it's also implying that Joseph is the legal father of Jesus. Nomos is the same Greek word used in the New Testament to refer to the law of Moses, the Torah. In other words, the legality of Joseph's paternity means not simply that Jesus can call him dad, but that Jesus is Joseph's descendant, his heir. And ultimately, that means that Jesus enters the covenant of God with Israel through Joseph. Now think about that. God enters the covenant with Israel once as one party in the covenant. It's God's covenant with his people, after all. In Jesus, he's now entering as the other party as well. And he's doing it through Joseph's family line, Joseph's royal family line. It's for this reason that in Luke's genealogy and in Matthew's genealogy, Jesus is traced through Joseph. Sometimes we can actually get bored reading those long lists of names, but the long lists are important because they do in the New Testament the same thing the long lists and genealogies do in the Old Testament. They trace God's relationship with his people over time. They trace the covenant. Now, the most eagle-eyed out there may recognize that we have a different name for Joseph's father in Luke, who names him Heli, than we do in Matthew, who lists his father as Jacob. Now, there are a couple possibilities there, and I don't want to dwell on that too much. They could be different names for the same person, or Matthew could be making a theological point, drawing a parallel with Joseph of the Old Testament, who was a son of Jacob, who's also known as Israel. And we'll talk more about that parallel in another video. And there's other differences in the genealogies too, but we shouldn't get hung up on those because the important thing to recognize is that in both genealogies, Jesus is identified as a descendant of David because Joseph is a descendant of David. In fact, Matthew's genealogy is itself structured around David. He shows a symmetrical presentation of the generations. 14 between Abraham and David, 14 between David and the exile, the point at which we no longer see a descendant of David on the throne of Judah, and now 14 between the exile and the return of the king in Christ. And the number 14 is significant. It's a multiple of the number 7, which has covenantal significance. Think of the Sabbath rest of the seventh day. But it's also the numerical value of David in Hebrew. The letters in the Hebrew alphabet are also used as numbers. We also say the king returns in Jesus, but the New Testament tells us that the descendants of David are still around and that Joseph is one of them. Luke's gospel, which depicts the Holy Family traveling from Nazareth to Bethlehem for the birth of Jesus because of a census, uses that opportunity to remind us of the royal lineage of Joseph. The passage reads, "And Joseph too went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David that's called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child." But this official registration in a census that only Luke tells us about not only shows Joseph's royal ancestry, it also marks Joseph making a public act to claim this ancestry. This acceptance of his royal lineage sets the stage for the birth of the King, Jesus. Now, in Luke's gospel, the royal ancestry is sharply contrasted with the meager conditions surrounding the birth of Christ, where there's no room at the inn and Jesus is placed in a manger. But we'll talk more about that in another video as well. So why is this lineage important? Well, if Jesus is the Messiah, he would need to be from the royal line of David, not only to fulfill the prophetic expectations, but also to demonstrate that God's promises are kept. In 2 Samuel 7, we see Nathan deliver the prophecy to David that his descendants will have an everlasting kingdom. And in the context, it sounds like a prophecy about Solomon, David's son. The background is that David wants to build a temple because the Ark of the Covenant is still housed in the portable tabernacle from the Exodus. And the message Nathan gives him is beautiful. He says that David, you won't build me a house, but I will build you a house, meaning a dynasty. Right? And the prophecy continues. It says, "When your days have been completed and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, sprung from your loins, and I will establish his kingdom. He it is who shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever." As we see later in the narrative, Solomon's the one who ends up building the temple. But the offspring who's actually fulfills this prophecy is not Solomon, but Jesus, many centuries later. So Joseph provides an entryway into God's covenantal promise, not just with Israel in general, but with David specifically. And he does so in a different way than anticipated. Remember the context in which Saul, the first king of Israel, arises, and David's anointed as king by Samuel after him. 1 Samuel 8 tells us that the request for a king in Israel is a direct rejection of God as Israel's rightful king. Yet God, in his loving mercy, still grants the request. And now fast forward to Jesus and to Joseph. Through David's line and Joseph's line, the kingship is now restored back to God in Jesus. It all comes full circle. And the kingdom has now widened in scope. It's now universal in scope. Furthermore, in relation to the prophecy of Nathan, Jesus establishes the house of God's name in his own physical body, and thus also within the royal house of David, but also in his church, his mystical body. And this completion of God's work, this restoration that's better than what was lost, this fulfillment of a promise given long ago, could not have happened without the willing participation of St. Joseph.